Okay, David, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. I appreciate this.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
yeah, sorry about the overtalk with the time delay here. Welcome. Now, you are down in Georgia, is that correct?
Yep, I'm in rural Georgia, a little bit outside of Athens.
And what took you down there? I knew that was a relocation a few years back.
Yeah, well, that was my mom had gotten sick and she was down here. We are from the Chicago area, but I came down to kind of be with her, and then when she passed, I stayed just because it was a rare opportunity to kind of explore a culture that I had been interested in for a long time, but didn't really have any access to up in Chicago. So
Well,
kind of the,
that's really why I invited you, because you've been very helpful to me. I'd say beyond helpful. I'd even use the word influential. Not only with who you have helped me get to know on a personal basis and a professional basis, but for two other things. And your particular take on occulture, the occult culture in pop culture, particularly from the what you call it, what dime store grimoires or gas
yeah,
station grimoires.
yeah. Yeah, that was, and that's one of the things, up in Chicago, I had been kind of studying more of the new thought schools, and some of the early 20th century, late 1800s kind of popular culture, like William Walker Atkinson and DeLawrence. Yogi Publications was up in Chicago, and DeLawrence was out of Chicago. So it was, I'd been looking at that. But I have a background in kind of scholarly studies of Christian subcultures. So being down in Georgia was an opportunity to kind of explore some of the charismatic and Pentecostal cultures. And one of the things I ran into was, exorcism manuals that were in the grocery store and at gas stations. I mean, I was driving up to New York one time, and I think it was in South Carolina. I went into a truck stop, and there was C. Peter Wagner, who's one of the leading theorists of strategic spiritual warfare in the neo-charismatic movement, and they had a book by him there. So it was just this really interesting dichotomy to me, where whenever exorcism comes up in the media, they always, usually the news or the magazine stories or whatever, go towards Catholic exorcism. But I knew from experience, my middle brother actually had worked for Pat Robertson and had been a pastor up in Virginia for a while. And he had done what's called deliverance ministry. And so, he was a Southern Baptist pastor that was doing exorcisms, essentially.
Maybe for the students listening, you could just briefly describe what is deliverance ministry and also what is strategic ministry. But I also want to point out here that my wife asked me several months ago, what was I doing, as I was taking a picture in the books aisle at Kmart, and I said I'm sending it to David, and I actually posted some things from an airport because of you. So,
Well, that's, I always joke, that I'm able to go to the grocery store and also do my research at the same time, because it's sitting right there. And, some of this, it's really interesting because some of the stuff, there's a book by John Eckhart, who is he's a charismatic minister up in, I believe the Chicago area. But he wrote a book called Prayers That Rout Demons and Break Curses. And this book was available at Walmart. You could go into the Walmart inspirational section and pick it up. And it was a book that essentially had, instructions for different types of demons that you would encounter in your practice and how to get rid of them. And the reason that I, jokingly called them grocery store grimoires or gas station grimoires was because it's a grammar of exorcism, and they follow that pattern. It's really fascinating. And the deliverance ministry thing is, it came out of Pentecostal practices and charismatic practices. essentially the idea that you're delivering the person from bondage to you know, a demon or some kind of demonic power. You know, and that deliverance movement really began kind of growing in the 70s. There were a lot of different books written about it. Exorcism it's a controversial practice in mainstream Christianity, and a lot of the Protestant denominations had kind of gotten rid of it. And the charismatics had picked it back up as one of the charismata that are available to a true believer.
Just,
So,
just to kind of reinforce that point, when I was doing research on exorcism, when I was getting a degree in theology, I did a paper on it, and I went to the Catholic Church at that area, the Diocese of Scranton, used the Diocese of Philadelphia, and their
right,
exorcist was very old. He was at St. Joseph's down there, and you may know that, of course, the actor who played Father Karras in the movie The Exorcist uh, lived in Scranton. He was from it. I'm from Scranton, and there's a monument to him there. So there's that strange connection there. But I also spoke to an Anglican, or excuse me, an Episcopal priest.
mm-hmm.
He told me some funny stories that were, just his own embarrassment in the area. And then, of course, the Lutheran minister, and they
Mm-hmm.
got me in touch with the Lutheran diocese. And I was then in touch with someone in Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Now, our listeners may recognize some of these terms from, this is the land of Dr. Leszewski. Okay, this is coal cracker area where there's a whole bunch of German folk magic in various degrees, and Slavic folk magic and Catholic folk magic that survives in different forms. And I went down there and I interviewed him about his experience. And at that time, he said, well, when he did this, he tells the bishop, the family is looking for an exorcism. They've got phenomena that he's witnessed going on. And the bishop says, well, we don't do that. He
Yeah,
says, what do I do? He goes, well, just go do a house blessing, which is ironic because the original ministers involved in the so-called exorcist case were originally Lutheran
right.
ministers before
Yeah,
the Catholic Church came in. I just want to frame that for our
yeah,
listeners because you and I know this.
yeah. Yeah, that's true. And the original folks who came in on The Exorcist, the story that the actual events that led to the writing of The Exorcist, they originally thought it was just a poltergeist phenomena, and had contacted the Rhine Center and had some of the researchers from the Rhine come out to investigate it. So yeah, that's a very interesting case that kind of crosses all these different areas that don't usually get talked about, like Lutheran exorcism, and in psychical research bridging into these areas, Um, yeah, and the deliverance thing is, it's one of the, so with strategic spiritual warfare, which kind of will help frame the deliverance thing as well, is it comes out of in the study of exorcism in systematic theology, and that oftentimes was more focused through missions work, because you would have missionaries go out to different areas where the dominant culture was still, had a strong belief and practice of magic in it. And when these missionaries would go out, not only would they find that the kind of standard, proselytization techniques were not effective because they couldn't promise the same things that the local practitioners could promise, but one of the things that many of them found was that they also weren't effective when they actually hit something that was going on. So a missionary would go out and they would encounter a situation where someone would say, oh, well, I can't become Christian because my house god says that's not right, and they'll kill my family. And the missionary would kind of poo-poo it and tell them, read the Bible and do whatever. And then sure enough, someone in their household would die. They would have some kind of phenomena going on, poltergeist type phenomena, or possession stuff, and the missionary would be freaked out because they didn't believe in that. So there was this long kind of, throughout the 20th century, there's been this sort of inroads of these beliefs and these practices through the mission's work, because they needed to find ways that were more effective for converting people when those people not only had belief, but also had phenomena that was occurring. And
I'm just going to say, this is interesting because it ties back to what Dr. Stephen Davies said at our, not this year's conference, but the previous year's conference regarding the Holy Spirit or spirit possession in early Christianity. And that is that these notions, and I remember my great uncle saying the same thing with his understanding of the growth of the early church in relation to mysticism and what we call esotericism, that we often don't understand that at that time, you were expected to be able to do something.
right. Yeah, you needed to have the actual, you needed to have the juice, you need to actually have results and be able to do it. It wasn't just Billy Graham kind of popularized the, just say you believe in Jesus and you're good to go kind of thing, and that definitely wasn't the case. And that's not the case on the ground for folks when they're actually in areas where phenomena is present and you have practitioners from other traditions that are fully capable of getting results. When you have someone go into that situation, they actually have to do something. And that interesting with the neo-charismatic practice, which is kind of where the grocery store grimoire stuff comes out of. Those people are drawing on it's one of the terms for it is the New Apostolic Reformation movement. But one of the founders of that movement, C. Peter Wagner, was a professor of missions at Fuller Theological Seminary. And what he did was not, he invented this idea of strategic spiritual warfare. But the interesting thing about it is that Fuller has a full sociological program. They have a full psychology program. And what he did was basically weaponize exorcism. So he took these concepts, which are from information operations in the military and media studies and all the rest of it, and he then bridged those with the charismatic exorcism practices. And so he created this whole kind of weaponized exorcism system, with terms like strategic spiritual warfare, or what we're describing before, where someone actually has to have results. He calls that a power encounter. So, you come in with the power of Christ against the power of whatever you're facing. They did what's called spiritual mapping. So they would actually go into areas and then do, kind of demographic studies of belief and get a concept for what were the major powers in that area. And then they would design strategic spiritual warfare plans to go out and conquer and kind of, overcome those powers. And folks may be familiar with that from seeing some of the prayer warfare stuff that goes on during the elections. I think the media always loves it when people are praying over a candidate or doing something like that, and that comes out of these kind of traditions, and it was fascinating to me when I first saw it. Was not only that these books were in the grocery store, but just how effective they are in terms of if you're just thinking about results-based practice. If you look at these things and you're familiar with other traditions, there's a lot of bridges in them, and there's a lot of because they are drawing on all this different stuff, even if it's just from a psychological perspective, the fact that they're literally doing information warfare.
Let me ask then, because it appears to me that three things come to mind. That we have with that a kind of neurolinguistic programming reframing. So this is something very important, and I've always said hypnosis, autosuggestion, NLP, learning about that is very important in terms of communication. So we seem to have that going on. Then we appear to have a sense of this collective, this force on force, the creation from that reframing of their own mantras, their own I don't want to say incantations, but invocations, their own, well, it's a mantra. It is a word that triggers associative responses for a specific result or effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
They know what they mean. And then the third is kind of related, and that is, it's kind of the question, because you have experience in other areas too, but a lot of your experience seems to be within a rural demographic, which is traditionally dismissed by intellectuals, by academia, and particularly by those in the spiritual path. Because where's the overlap between this and what you would see as the more refined notions within the New Age movement or occultism? And also, and this is more of an experiential question, do you find that these rural areas tend to have a higher level of paranormal phenomena?
Yeah, and so the overlap question is an interesting one. One of the in a conversation I was having with David Smith, who's a Kabbalistic contemplative practitioner, he made the comment, "Go where the fire is," right? Like if you're looking for something, go where it's burning and it's hot and it's going. And one of the things with especially New Age and kind of New Age and sort of the occulture, and it goes back to this question of results. Are people getting results? Are they actually doing work? Are they showing work in their life? Are they demonstrating the kind of things that they talk about? And a lot of it bridges on kind of an aesthetic subculture more than it does people actually doing something that has results. And one of the things that I found in the rural areas is that you're these people, because they're good Christians, quote unquote, right? But they have these other experiences. So the phenomena is there and the results are there. And oftentimes, you'll find people who are, just good church going people, but you can tell from the way that they act and the kind of their presence that they're operating on a different level. They're actually doing contemplative work through having actually just been proper church going people, but they don't know any of these terms. And outside of that kind of like higher concept of divine union kind of stuff, which does, I have encountered that these kind of people that say they've met Jesus and they're they're mystics, but they're not, no, you wouldn't tell the difference. They look like just normal average folks. But in terms of kind of different practices in that, there's a southern practice, and it's probably common through most folk magic practices, but the idea of talking out fire or praying out the fire. And I first encountered that when I was working at a charismatic food ministry, and a woman that I was working with got a call. Her daughter had just gotten burned, and she was talking about it. And our logistics guy, right? I mean, this guy's a trucker, okay? Like, I mean, he's running the truck logistics for the food to get where it's going to go. And he comes from a holiness background, so he's kind of not prosperity gospel, but charismatic church, like Pentecostal, speaking in tongues kind of thing. And he goes, "Oh, she's been burned. Well, did you want me to talk out the fire? I can probably do it over the phone." And she was like, "Oh no, she'll be okay. It's not that bad of a burn." And I asked him after, we'd kind of gotten to a break or lunch or whatever. I was like, "Hey, you just said talking out the fire. Are you saying what I think you're saying?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, you just, there's some things I can say. There's a prayer that I can use. There's a little passage in the Bible, and the burn goes away." And I was like, "Well, how did you learn this?" And he's like, "Well," and he kind of got like a little cagey, and then I was like, "No, I'm not going to say you're a heretic or anything. So what are you talking about?" And he's like, "Well, it can only be passed female to male or male to female. My wife's, grandmother knew it and she was taught it. And so one time one of our kids got burned and she gave it to me and she passed it on to me." And I was like, "Wait, okay." So I went and I Googled, and there's different folklore. You can go to the different folklore of Adams County is a book that has a ton of, it's just a whole collection of mid 20th century practices that were gathered by this fellow that had gone out to Adams County and done this research. And he's also one of the major researchers in the conjure culture and hoodoo and that. So I went and I pulled that out. I looked up Talking Out the Fire. And sure enough, you know, Library of Congress has mid 20th century descriptions of this practice, which he was doing. And I was like, have you ever looked into this? And he's like, no, I haven't. You know, I was just taught it and I can do it. So he had no mediated version of this. It was literally just passed to him. And, you know, in every other instance, this guy was, you know, a good Christian, like no questions asked. And here he's doing something which, if you Google Talking Out the Fire, you're going to get neo-pagan and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I showed him that and he was like, oh, wow. Well, the one, they don't know how to do it. That's not how you do it. And he's like, that's not even the right passage. That's not it. And he's like, but two, I didn't know any of this was out there. Really? People know about this? You know, and I found that again and again with these living streams of transmission, which actually need results, you know. I had another experience at the property that I was living on for the last couple of years where I'm no longer there, but the Historical Society had come over and there was a local guy that he was kind of talking about his family's history in the area and that. And they knew that I was interested in this kind of stuff. And his wife told me, hey, ask Walter about his great uncle. And so I did. And his great uncle turned out to be known locally as Doc Paul. And he could speak out the fire. He did healings of thrush, you know, which is it's a fungal infection that gets into infants it was pretty nasty back in the day. He could do that. He could heal burns, stop bleeding is another one that he was able to do. And, you know, he gave me this whole history of his great uncle just through oral tales of his family and that. And, you know, it's still there. And again, you know, this is everyday kind of stuff. One of the things I was surprised with recently at a folk festival that I was at, it was a local folk festival. You know, this wasn't some big regional thing. It was just local artists and that. And every single person there, no matter what they were doing, had a story about some form of phenomena. They had no question about it. It wasn't even something weird to them. You know, I mean, from out of body experiences to, you know, dream precognition, the whole thing, it was all there. And it was just the way that they grew up, the way that they lived, you know, and it was directly in their thing. And they may use different language for it, like Jesus told me this or whatever, but, you know, strip off the kind of the mythological overpenning and the abilities and the living was there.
Well, you touched on something that's really important, and that is how living traditions work. And having grown up in that environment, and my great uncle being involved in not only the massive 20th century occultism, but also through his father and his family, Brauke, or what's called powwow, German folk magic. But for them, it was beyond just the folk traditions of a little bit of healing. My grandmother also, I have her blood-stained Bible somewhere from where, you know, of course, going to Ezekiel to stop the blood.
Right.
And one of the more interesting things is that those traditions, when they go in that oral way, they're not very formal.
Right.
And people get very confused about what constitutes a formal teaching. And I also see that framework is part of the power of suggestion. That is, one imbibes or absorbs these teachings over time in a dynamic relationship, rather than trying to memorize things and
Right.
just, you know, and force their way through it through the book of the month. And this brings to my mind what Pat Zaleski often said, Zaleski, excuse me, about his experiences in the Golden Dawn. You know, he was in the last Golden Dawn temple. They were isolated, but they had quite a few adepts. He goes, the amount of people on the adept level was stunning. He said, but when you went to a teaching, it wasn't always in the lodge. It might be at someone's house or in a cafe or at, you know, the barbecue.
Right.
And that this kind of practice was very living and dynamic. And I've had lamas say the same thing to me. That said, you know, I understand when you're in a nomadic herding culture where you're moving like that, the teaching is as you're walking. It's not necessarily always
Right.
in learned form. And it's a whole different framework of of vitality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually gonna to bring that up about in Buddhist practice, a lot of esoteric Buddhism is taught like that. It's immediate, and it's, there's the formal, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, you have the kind of formal sitting on a throne and presenting the teachings. But a lot of the transmission and that goes on in ways that are much more subtle and more immediate and everyday, while you're having a meal or whatever. And I think people coming into these things through the media and through very mediated structures have a much different understanding of that, or an you
This
know
well, this is important because you've used the term media and mediated, and I know that you're being very careful in your use of words, very precise, and I appreciate that because I've never really thought of it that way in terms of being mediated, as well as what we're going to talk about now in terms of occulture and media. But that is one of the things that Pat said. He goes, the problem being is that many people would come to the Golden Dawn and they would only experience it through having read, at that time, maybe the books by Rigardi, and they would become what he phrased as Golden Dawn fundamentalists.
hmm
And I would see the same thing with some folks at that time, and even worse now in AMORC. They would kind of become, we used to call them AMORCians, but my one friend calls them their fundamentalists. They
right.
don't really understand. They're not really having the experiences, but they don't really understand what's going on either. Um, so that possibility of occult fundamentalism is very strong. So that brings us to the question of, what do you see right now as vital within the broader occulture or occult aspects in the broader culture, and why is it important to us?
I think the media thing hits on it. I think that so many people are coming into it through websites, internet blogs, depending on how your algorithm on Facebook is set up. I got an ad today for the most dangerous man in America who teaches, he's given, I didn't, I skimmed through the buzzwords and laughed at the aesthetics of it. But he was being promoted by Ken Wilber, as being the one to transmit non-dual awareness to the West. This guy is the chosen one, and I got that in a sponsored ad on Facebook. And so this kind of stuff where, and Ken Wilber is a good example of a very popular figure, very heavily mediated. You can watch on YouTube conversations that he has with, there's one with Thomas Keating, who made the centering prayer and kind of brought contemplative practice back into popular Catholicism and Christianity. And Wilber just talks over Keating. And, it's just, Wilber's known as the charts guy. He has all these different charts for how everything happens and all of that. And, I think part of it, I've lived in rural Georgia now for, 7 years or so, but I don't see any charts when I go outside. That's kind of handy for having that in mind. Like, okay, you can kind of get these relationships and that, but the actual experience of it's not a chart. And the more you go into the chart, the less you have the actual experience, and you're starting to then intermediate, I think it's really important with the occulture because it's an aesthetic subculture. It's tied into music culture. It's tied into, you have, academic essays now being written about like esoteric heavy metal and how does the occult and heavy metal bridge in, and that's all interesting, but it's not actual practice. And I think that the differentiation between actually doing the work and the inner work and the outer work, actually doing that work versus, being really interested in the t-shirt, and wearing the t-shirt and having all the aesthetics of these practices. And I see it, you mentioned the kind of fundamentalist aspects of it. I've seen a lot of talk, amongst the neo-hermeticists of, was William Walker Atkinson truly hermetic? And it's obvious from their discussion that they're stuck on, his language
You're breaking up a little bit there. The last thing we heard clearly from you was his language.
Oh, am I better now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, they're stuck on his language and his kind of mythological framing, this kind of narratives that he put over it, this sort of neo-Egyptian kind of thing. And they've never actually done any of the practices that he recommends, or read the Hermetica and done the practices that they recommend, because when you start to see the actual just practical value in either one of them, there is a deep similarity and resonance there,
I find it ironic too that some folks within the Golden Dawn, who shall remain nameless, we're posting blogs about this very topic, and they're the last ones that should be casting stones on anyone's with regards to connectivity to tradition.
Right. Right. Well, and the Hermetica itself were collected works that were written for a popular audience, if you look at the history of it.
There was folk magic of its time.
Yeah.
What we think of as Egyptian high magic,
Yeah.
the Egyptian papyrus and all that, that was the New Age magic of its time.
Yeah. Exactly. And they come out of popular movements, and they come out of kind of the popular, and and it's interesting because they then get turned into kind of, bring it into a sort of mystery cult concept. A cult is a mystery cult, and you're not going to get the inner stuff. It's not, you know what I mean? That's not going to be the actual, when you go through the mysteries, like, you don't get the pamphlet at the end of it that has the, the whole thing. So to kind of convert these things into that, and then say, it's this and it's this mediation process that's happened, and it always happens, and it continues to happen. I think that the internet sort of speeds it up, and I think it's really important for people to to go where the fire is, to actually find that, to find people who have connections to other, other traditions and connections to practice, and actually kind of delve into that as well, and get a better sense for the lived experience of it, as opposed to what the book says or what was written about it.
And this goes back to, again, growing up in an area that had a lot of blue collar, Catholic devotees. I mean, everyone knew someone, a grandmother, an aunt, someone who had some kind of esoteric connection on that level. And not esoteric, it is esoteric in that it's inner, but not as we generally understand the term. It's a religious mysticism that they adhered to. And, where I get pizza shells and pasta 3 blocks from where I'm sitting, they have Padre Pio on the wall.
Right.
And people want to see this guy's grandmother to get the holy oil that she makes, the blessed oil. And this is all part of a living, vital spirituality, which is part of the day-to-day, as opposed to something that is where, again, you get the t-shirt.
Right.
Here, as you know, it's really recent. The Institute for Hermetic Studies, we just started putting some classes online on a teachable platform. And one of the things I'm glad I haven't done is hit the certificate button.
Right.
Yeah, that's not what it's about. It's not about getting the certificate. It's about getting the experiences that allow you to know reality.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the certificate. That's you get the certificate on a different level. And a lot of times too, I mean, there's and this has been a term for a long time, but certificate collectors, and people who collect initiations, and each different or each different kind of lineage stream has a different flavor. It has a different aspect to it. So there is something to be said about learning from different schools, learning from different teachers. But to just gather up, your grades and certificates and all the rest of it, and think that that means anything, that's not what that's about.
Well, we call them pedigree collectors, and that's a terrible burden within Western initiatic movements, and has been for decades now. it really exploded on the scene in the 90s. It really took off then because of the internet.
Yeah.
And early 2000s, it exploded. And what we saw was a tremendous amount of organizations who were essentially jealous of AMORC's success, but still wanted to ride on it. That is, these were Rosicrucian, Martinist, Templar groups who wanted access to that membership to grow their own groups. And understandably, they had something to offer, or they were part of organizations that AMORC had mentioned in its earlier writings. But what we saw was, and I have CDs that were given to me, stacks of teachings.
Right.
They were given to me, and they're fine. But what we'd run into is many folks would have initiations, and you see this was a joke within Gnosticism, all bishops, no church. And everyone would go around and become a bishop or a free initiative or something. And they want to be in charge now. They want to be the guy in charge who tells everyone else what to do. But they get these initiations and no teachings.
Right.
So it was, we even called them broom closet initiations, because sometimes the rooms you get it in were so small. And this was terribly destructive, because then what it created was, in its place, a lot of the teachings which were then generated. Some of them were very good. They were connected. Others, which I noticed, were just this atrocious amalgamation of different ideas and it just, there was no, it was a syncretic nightmare rather than a synthesis.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, with some of the Santa Muerte research that I've done, over the years, looking at the growth of a devotional tradition centered on Saint Death, it's been a really interesting opportunity to see that in kind of a microcosm, where here's a hidden tradition that was a folk tradition up until 2001, and then it goes public, and to see the ways that its public growth has led to, again, the idea of mediation, and that has led to books, and this is the true path of Santa Muerte, and this is all that. And it's hilarious to see, because because it is a microcosm. Santa Muerte comes out of a specific culture, of a specific demographic, of a specific heavily folk Catholic, heavily Catholic culture. So when the true Santa Muerte is New Age, goddess, all of this other stuff, and very well that it came from a folk saint, in Mexico, you can see these kind of deviations, and the kind of authoritative voice that people will come forward with, that saying, oh, no, they didn't understand it back then, but it wasn't public until 2001. And so this, person from Minnesota or something is, who's been in contact with Santa Muerte and knows the truth, versus the, 90-year-old grandma in Mexico City who's been, devoted to Santa Muerte since the 70s or something, you can see that the kind of, and it's silly when you see it in that sense, whereas in terms of Western esoteric practice, sometimes that gets kind of hidden, because people can come up with backstories or, these different kind of mythologies that float around it. And it's much harder to tell, like, well, maybe there was somebody in New Orleans who had a thing from France, that had a thing from, Eastern Russia, that, allowed them to have the secret knowledge. Where with, I've seen it with the Santa Muerte thing, where you can't say that. Like, it came, exactly where it came from, exactly what it was. And the person now claiming something else is, whatever they're doing may be legitimate, in the sense that they've tapped into something that works, but it's not legitimate in terms of the lineage that they're trying to claim,
Well, we saw that happen with Powwow, with Silver Ravenwolf.
Yeah.
Her book, geez, what was the original name of it? Powwow, I think, and then they changed it to American Folk Religions, in which she tried to reframe the whole practice in terms of a veiled paganism.
Right.
And that's just simply not the case. There are some aspects of it, and Hunter Yoder, who has done extensive writing on hexology. He is a hex sign painter by profession. He's fabulous. He's discussed a lot of this Germanic Teutonic aspects within it, but that is a rarity and is very, very different from what she was talking about.
Right.
She was just taking different pagan goddesses and gods and just slapping it in there, and it's just not the way it is. That's not the tradition.
Right. Yeah, and you see that with Southern root work and conjure, where people make no differentiation between root work and conjure. And there's a complete, root work is working with roots. It's working with materia magica, and conjure is conjuring. You're working with spirits, and that. And people will mix and match the two and claim that they learned it from somebody, and they're, following this hand cultivated true tradition of hoodoo, and they don't even know the difference between these two very, very different in practice. Like if you actually were to go and learn from someone, you would know when you're working with materia magica versus when you're drawing a circle and writing a name and working with spirits. Like it's a quite a different kind of deal there, but they still sell it as being the true thing. And the funny thing too is, living in the South, I had one of my favorite experiences with that was I was living in Monroe, Georgia, and there was a restaurant. There was an alley behind my apartment, and there was a restaurant like right down the alley. And I was out in the alley one day. I was coming back from something, and one of the cooks from the restaurant was going home. And, I said hi and introduced myself because I just moved in, and he introduced himself. And he asked me what I did. And it was when I had first moved to Georgia, and I was still kind of feeling out, I was like, I don't know if I want to say, what I write about and what I research. So so I was kind of hesitant, and I was like, well, I write about weird stuff. And he was like, oh, like what? And, I kind of like soft sold it. And I was like, well, you've seen those like ghost shows. I was trying to like give him something like History Channel, like this is safe, don't worry, and he goes, oh, yeah. Well, that's fine. Yeah. My dad used to be, he used to be a seer, and he healed people. And so he went into this whole story of his dad, who was a conjure doctor in Atlanta. And he gave me a whole bunch of stories and memories that he had with his dad. And a couple months later, a friend of mine was coming over, went down to let him into the building, and Preston, who was the cook, was there walking down the alley. And so I introduced my friend to Preston, and my friend starts busting into stuff about oh yeah, you do that hoodoo and conjure stuff, right? Like your dad was a conjure guy. And I never said the word conjure, I never said the word root work, I never said any of that. And so Preston was he was talking to me about all this stuff. My friend goes through this mediated like, oh, sound magic and blah blah and all these terms, and he's like, yeah, getting people fixed, and he's running through the dictionary of terms. And Preston was like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
He just shut up, and he was like, no, I don't, that's not it. I don't know. And he was done with him, And so when you go and you see this stuff being, the hoodoo tarot or something like that, it's so funny to realize that nobody talks about that down here, and yet it's all around,
I have found that I have had more aggravation from New Age true believers, and in recent years from various would-be initiates, than I ever have had from fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, evangelicals, any of that type.
Yeah.
And I have found that if you present yourself in a respectful manner and just put, just throw a line out there, throw the hook out, see if they bite, and let people talk, they will tell you the most amazing stories.
Yeah.
And people say, how do you get these stories? I said, you just got to learn to listen.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something, yeah, I think that's something that's another kind of desperately needed thing, especially with people who want to go into practice, is to listen, you know, and to hear these things, and to be able to recognize them when they're around, and recognize them for what they are, and not terminology and all the rest of it, because I mean, one of the important things for me, and again, I've been living in a rural area for a long time, but it's people, and it's real life. And I think that if you're hyper mediated and wearing costumes and going for the aesthetics and the subculture of it, you're missing out on kind of the depth of what you could be accessing with spiritual practice.
But that's part of the folk practice as a whole, though, has to do with what we would call the energy of the place.
Yeah.
And you hear a lot of folks talk, oh, the energies, but it's just all they're talking about is some hormonal rush or nerve tingling they're getting at a place. It's a sensory overload. To actually sense the energies of a place requires a certain quietude.
Mm-hmm.
And also a range that you're allowing that quietude to expand into, not just a narrowness of hot, cold, good, bad, whatever you think, but has to be able to have it's a gradation,
Right.
like consciousness itself. And that when you're closer to life and death situations, closer to the earth, closer to life and death, closer to reality on a certain level, on that regard, then the sense of the energy of the place, the intuitive awareness is there.
Right.
And you see that when you're dealing with people who deal with dangerous machinery or dangerous people.
Right.
That you have to develop that intuition to know what's really going on here.
Well, and this is it goes back to Sadir and initiations, right? In that book, which I would highly recommend folks check out, and you've recommended it as well. The high practitioner in that book lives in a rural area, right? And is absolutely in tune with the place and the people and the everyday people. And his encounters with the everyday people are much deeper than when he has people over to his house. He has the gatherings of esotericists from various schools and various philosophies and practices. And he takes a way different tenor with them than he does with the everyday people that he encounters, and I think that book overall is just a fascinating and fantastic book for kind of reframing the ways that we've been sort of led to think about things now.
And well, within that book too, and he there's a discussion about egregores and what they are.
Right.
And I have a letter from Sadir's last remaining pupils.
Right.
She was in her 90s when she wrote to me many years ago, and it's a small treasure that I have. But you said something really critical there, that the direct experience is what this is all about. It's not the mediated experience, and we mediate our experiences through our meditations.
Mm-hmm.
And how we formulate a meditation. That is really often we are not truly meditating. What we're doing is concentrating or contemplating, that we're not actually entering into the state of unmediated experience.
Right.
And if you look at Dzogchen, which is considered the ninth yana of the highest yana, highest vehicle, that increasingly goes to unmediated experiences. If we look at Raja Yoga, that is all about the unmediated experience, and that's considered the royal path. The eight limbs of yoga there is all about clearing out your mind to perceive reality as it is. And people often get very upset when I say, well, ritual magic as we understand it is very nice, but compared to if you were to stack it up to the different systems, it's still an outer tantra.
Right. Right. And then without the, well, and I think this came up in your the memorial that we were talking about earlier before the recording. where what was it, the necromancy as working on the self was brought up. And I think that, one of the interesting things with ritual magic is, and this is where I find the grocery store grimoires fascinating as well, is they're a vehicle that can be used. And depending on how you interpret it, it's like the term apocalypse, right? People can read it outwardly, but there's inner practices that can be worked with in those things as well. Where do those things sit that move towards a sort of unmediated thing? I think that's probably a more advanced practice with those things, and they're not ultimately necessary for that, but they're in some ways can be turned as a vehicle if you look for that. And I think that's one of the unfortunate things about the asceticism, is that it pulls people away from looking at things like that. It really reifies these outward interpretations and these outward uses of these things.
Well, asceticism it's an egregore. It's
Yeah,
a it's a social control mechanism. It's a social construct. It's a limitation. It's a channel. And as you stated, it's the mind through the senses driven outward rather than the mind taking that information, moving inward, and then even moving further
yeah,
to relocate the center of consciousness into the unconscious.
yeah,
Yeah. It's playing with the paraphernalia and being very concerned about, well, as what happened, I was at one retreat many years ago, and I was picking up the manuals, the prayer books, and they were these 3-ring binders. And as you know, those things don't always stack very well. You have to kind of rotate them to get them to stack nicely. And one of the women there was very upset with what I had done. I said, what is it? Because, well, the Buddha can't be upside down. And I said, well, if the Buddha's everywhere, then there's never upside down.
right, right,
It's that kind of
exactly,
dogmatism isn't the word. Fundamentalism is the word.
right.
Rigidity. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely, and that in finding when those things to me are little doorways into kind of re-understanding and reopening, opening up to deeper understandings. And I think a lot of my research plays with that on a personal level, because I think in those junctures where you find those things, it's often an opening to a new understanding. And one of the things that I've done with the spending a lot of time with psychical research and parapsychology, and that has been on that level of, I found early on when I started writing about esoteric practice and parapsychology in parallel, that both camps got upset. The parapsychologists were like, no, 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 we're not doing any of that. And the esotericists were like, oh, this is psychic studies, or that's beyond, and we don't know, that's the simple, whatever. And to me, it was goofy, because if you talk to, for instance, the remote viewers, Joe McMoneagle, he's a Zen practitioner that has been able to flatline EKGs. So he not only had the biofeedback results that showed that he was in this undifferentiated state, and that's where he maximizes his effective, thing. And then you look in, Russell Targ is constantly quoting Pantajali and, looking at the Yoga Sutras, whether or not they, go to the deepest levels of practice with that, like that's not really here nor there when you're doing when I'm researching, but that the possibilities there, and it also has the results factor too. You get people who are practicing ritual magic and they're saying they're getting results, but are they really? In parapsychology there's ways to test that, and that was what was cool. I think you kind of have extended that olive branch, to parapsychology, in terms of well, let's test this, right? Like let's
Well,
see. Well,
well, let's hammer that point home. First off, that for those who don't know, I mean, David was responsible for really helping me shape a presentation I gave um, in 2019 at the Psi conference down in Durham, and it was about that crossover between It was called Crossroads at Midnight, and where parapsychic research and tradition meet. And as Dale Graff said at the end of it, who of course was head of the Army's psychic research program for quite a while, he said, "Well, you've given me quite a few things to think about, and quite a few I'd rather not." There's a tremendous resistance to understanding this crossover from both fields, tremendous. And of course, in terms of results, of course, Leszewski and Albertus were always about what are the results, where's the proof? And Dubuis used to say that alchemy was the one area where there was no delusion, because you either transmuted something or you didn't. But within ceremonial magic and other areas, there was ample room for self-delusion. And and I would, of course, now we've seen that on almost steroids in many levels with a variety of practices. So that question of what are the results that I'm getting? But Patanjali is important because the Yoga Sutras were probably brought to Egypt at some point, maybe in the 4th century. And there was an Arabic translation of them. And I remember quoting this somewhere, that somehow that maybe made itself into Europe as part of the early, and we use the term loosely, Hermetic and Rosicrucian groups. But that also points to something that is very critical. Most of these Western occult groups don't have adequate mind training.
Right.
They don't. They jump into ritual work, memorization, visualization, but they use the mind. They don't, and then they end up getting used by it. They don't learn how to go through it into states of unmediated experience, unmediated awareness, which is difficult. I'm not going to say it's easy, it's difficult. But those, the sutras of Patanjali are very useful for that. I just want to frame for our listeners where a lot of this fits in. Yeah. You were great for that, by the way. Thank you for helping me ruffle tons of feathers and all sorts of stuff. So feel free to take that ball and go with it if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it's I actually a couple days ago had the opportunity to have an extended conversation with a woman who is a psychokinesis experiencer. She had a near-death experience that kind of led to her manifesting these different abilities, one of which is extreme psychokinesis, to the point where she's no longer comfortable doing lab tests and she's been tested at all the major parapsychology labs. So she's been to the Rhine Center. She's been to Persinger's lab, if people are familiar with Persinger's God helmet work. He did a lot of if you Google God helmet, like you'll see it's basically like a electro stimulation device for your head. He was trying to figure out what exactly is causing apparitional experiences, can we enhance psychic functioning by zapping the brain, kind of thing. And he did a lot of work with that. And that was trying to control for the possibility of, in poltergeist phenomena or in a haunting phenomena, are we seeing the human body reacting to electromagnetic fields? So he thought, well, what if we do these experiments with this helmet that will really intensify that? So, she's been there because a lot of the psychokinesis stuff has to do with, blowing light bulbs, electronic failures and that kind of thing. So he was testing her with that. But she was talking about how she's no longer comfortable in labs, because if she's on site in a lab, the researchers oftentimes say, oh, well, it was a machine malfunction, or did you cheat? Are you cheating right now? And even though she's not, and it's a controlled experiment, there's always this doubt because she's there. So what she prefers is to do the experiments at a distance. So, and I'm talking about moving things, right? So there's one of the experiments is with what's called a psi wheel, which the technical term is an Egli wheel. Egli was the guy who invented it, but it's basically a hyper low resistance wheel that they use in psychokinesis testing. I don't know what its original function was, but in terms of psychokinesis testing, it's, can you move the wheel, right? Can you make it spin? And so, you know, some of the experiments that she's done are, you know, she's up in Canada, researchers wherever, you know, including Europe and all over the place. And she spins the wheel, right? And, you know, I mean, that's a direct test of ability, you know, that's a direct result kind of test. Funny, you know, funny thing with that is that even then the researchers are like, oh, well, it got hot in here. Or she said one researcher told her that the sun had gone down. So that was the reason that the thing was working. Or
Just
it had
just for some
changed.
background for you, I've seen variations of that where it's a folded paper star on top of a pin on
Yes,
a
yeah,
cork, or sometimes it'll be something a little more elaborate, like the paper umbrella
right,
from a drink, and but it will be under a glass dome, like the kind
right,
you would have for a clock. So there's no air current hitting this.
right,
I mean, this is just a simple experiment to control for. You know, it's not rocket science by any stretch. There's no reason for that to move, or should we say spin. We could
right,
possibly account for movement by vibration, but spinning is a different story.
right.
And I've seen that done in some old AMORC lodges, by the way, back in the
Yeah,
day.
that's, you know, and that's the interest, you know, that the history of psychical research and esoteric practice, there's these things diverged in at about the time when Ryan, JB Ryan started in kind of inventing laboratory parapsychology. There was a concerted effort to move any possibility of, you know, quote unquote occultism out of the practice, because prior to that, you know, the early Society for Psychical Research, uh, Henri Bergson, right, who was one of the presidents of the Society for Psychical Research, his sister was Moina Mathers. So, you know, I mean, there were direct connections, and you have Andrew Lang, who was he was, oh, I forget the guy's. He did a lot of kind of scrying work in that. He was there's a book out that's like it's not the Rosicrucian Notebook, but it's something. He was he did a lot of scrying work, and he collected books is what he's famous for. I forget what his name is, but Andrew Lang worked in a small seance group with him, you know, in taking you know, getting channelers and scryers to bring these messages forward and do ESP experiments and that. So there was this really deep connection between, you know, these different groups, which, you know, still kind of drifts a little bit through, but it's definitely on the outside is a no-no. Like that's not, that those never the twain shall meet kind of thing, you know. But and that's where I got really interested when I realized, looking at the AMORC stuff, or looking at William Walker Atkinson, you know, who will be writing about yoga practice and then quoting an SPR, you know, article, the Society for Psychical Research article, you know, or De Lawrence, where he's mixing everything together. And you've got, you know, psychical research, hypnotism, you know, early, before it was called Neurolinguistic Programming, you know, there he's got his book, The Master Key, which is essentially neurolinguistic programming without the label, you know. And all of that stuff mixes together, you know, and that those bridges, rediscovering those is really powerful, because you start to see, you know, it, one, in comparing these things, the kind of the false gold veneer of esoteric practice falls off, you know, like you start to remove the gold paint and realize that some of these things aren't, you know, it's not quite as, it's the words that surround it that make it look so, you know, this high and mysterious thing, you know, can be described in another way, which is very direct and everyday, you
Well, you
know.
don't need to memorize associations on tarot cards, you know, and lots of ideas about astrology and alchemy, or what you believe astrology and alchemy to be, or, you know, argue over what is the proper names of the angels of the spheres of the tree of
Right,
life to have these experiences. What you need to have
right,
is an understanding of your own mind.
right,
And if
exactly,
the notion is to man know thyself, woman know thyself, that's different than knowing all these other things. And in knowing yourself, you develop the apparatus and the key discrimination so that when you encounter these other domains, you have a sense of what's happening. And this was a big discussion I had with David Burnett, who was the Grand Treasurer of the English Grand Lodge of AMORC in the 90s, early 90s. And he and I were very close, and I've done an interview with him that we've got available and transcribed. And we said, you know, AMORC was incredibly good at helping people have these experiences, but it wasn't really good on helping to prepare them for what they might encounter in them.
Right.
It's kind of a strange paradox. And maybe we could use that as a jumping off point, because that's what my paper or my presentation at the Psi conference was about, that you guys really don't know what you're going to encounter out there.
Right.
You know, this is like, you know, if you go hunting for tigers, you've got to be prepared to find one.
Right.
And the tiger might find you before you find it.
Right. Right.
That there's a very kind of naive human-centric idea about what the universe is composed of, but that spreads out into the popular political views that there are current within occultism, the transhumanist movement, but I'm thinking of the transpersonal movement,
Right.
transpersonal psychology. Everything was always incredibly and human-centric, to the point where whenever I read it, I find myself just getting almost lost in my own head, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the major weaknesses of it. And it's, you know, and that's part of the concerted effort to move it away from all of this stuff. You know, and early on it had a function. You know, when J.B. Ryan was doing that, he was doing that within a very specific context, cultural context, as well as what he was trying to do in terms of his specific areas of research to bring them to academia, and to, you know, what then led into some of the more focused government efforts and think tank efforts and that. But at this point, it's become its own egregore and its own, you know, mythology that surrounds this stuff, its own kind of false metaphysics, which, you know, ignores all these other things. And it's amazing to me, you know, talking about the tiger, right? So one of the things that this particular psychokinesis experiencer had when she was at the Rhine Center was what's known as the contagion effect. So she went, demonstrated the wheel spinning and that, and when she left, the wheel continued to spin. And people, when she was there, who couldn't spin the wheel before that, suddenly started to be able to spin the wheel. And there was a tapering off of this, you know, over time it stopped. The wheel stopped spinning for everybody, and it didn't work. But, you know, there was this period after she had gone where it was still there, you know. And I had asked some folks about that, about, you know, how do you, you know, in popularizing these things, how do you work with the contagion factor? Because, you know, taking it at its most mundane level, or a more mundane level, kids studying psychokinesis in rural Georgia, where I live, and starts to manifest it, things start to happen. They haven't really controlled their subconscious. They don't have any kind of inner knowledge or inner calm. So things start to get crazier, right? And then suddenly they're being slammed in the face with the Bible because their fundamentalist parents think that they're demon possessed, you know. And, you know, whatever other possibilities are out there, just the ability to manifest psychokinesis in and of itself in certain cultural places could really, you know, hurt somebody. And when you have, you know, when you have this stuff kind of going out and spreading out, and it has a false metaphysics that they don't understand, and they're just kind of like, this is great, you know, and not thinking about the kind of repercussions of that. And the other thing with it too, on a deeper level, is that Charles Tart wrote an essay called Fear of Psi. And, you know, even within the research paradigm, there is this concerted kind of fear of what they encounter, especially when they encounter strong experiencers. And an experiencer is somebody who falls into, I was talking to one guy and I joked with him that he got the dessert before he got the meal. He had all this phenomena occurring, and I was trying to kind of guide him back towards like, okay, well, here's what this means in a different context, and here's kind of how to integrate this stuff. But he was everything that was being described in the practices as the end result of phenomena that you still had to move past, he had encountered it without the practice, just for that was his karma kind of thing. But that those questions are not really brought up, and there's a long history, and Mark, this because I mean that's kind of one of the things in Egregore, and a lot of your writing is this concern, but there's a long history of people that they enter this area and either they go nuts or things kind of crumble around them. George Hampson's work is fully focused on this idea of he focuses it through the archetype of the trickster, but it's not uncommon. I have a friend who researches just popular paranormal stuff and writes about it from that framework. And he is drifting into, having been exposed to some of this stuff, he's drifting into fear, and he's drifting into kind of life collapse. He's kind of teetering towards it as these things kind of shake his upbringing, and what his assumptions were, and this, I don't, it, there is phenomena and it does occur, and if you're not prepared for it,
well, that's the notion of what, how we prepare people for the experience. And the contagion aspect is sought after. That's the whole nature of magic, contagion magic. It's sympathetic magic and contagion.
Right.
Is that, and that when you perform a practice, a sadhana, you do it in the same place every day at the same time to break the mind, to form the habit, the rehabit, but also because of the contagion factor.
Right.
And a holy spot is holy because of the contagion factor. When the Soviets were doing their psychic research, they were scouring the massive countryside for old women and old men.
Right.
They weren't finding a lot of these folks in cities, because the nature of city life is an assault on the senses and a dulling of the mind in many ways, whereas the rural area, the senses are more alive.
Right.
And it's easier to get into tune with what's happening. There's a sensitivity of the senses is in fact a psychic sensitivity, because it's a continuum. It's not just but that aspect that you mentioned of contagion is one which is really critical, and how it jumps, and with it the insanity aspect. I use that term roughly, but George Hanson's book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, I was talking to George yesterday, by the way, and it's a critical book. Everyone should read it. In fact, when I was talking to David, he was in AMORC as a grand treasurer right after the great financial crisis that caused a schism in the order. And I was asking him, it's been 30 years, full Saturn cycle. All I want to know is, what were the lessons learned? What was the framework for that event? How much there was trust in a hierarchy. That hierarchy was, cosmically inspired or led, or these kinds of things, these mythologies that grew up around it. And there's some truth to it, but there's also, when does that truth simply become an old story? A fiction, a convenient fiction. It might work for one leader, but not for another. And we spoke about that. We spoke about, how did the credibility factor, with, in that case, Gary Stewart, and in many people's minds, even Christian Bernard, even though he just recently retired after 30 years, how did they lose their credibility at different points in the eyes of some people? And I've said this briefly to you, and I've said it to others, and I'll say it again here for the record. there's many things I would like to say, but I'm also very cautious about it because I don't want to put anything in writing or on the record that threatens my credibility. Because it's so easy. There's just that moment. There's so easy when it's easy to jump the shark. And that's part of knowing your own mind. Knowing when to not listen to that impulse. Because I'm looking at, who is it? The MD who wrote the book on abduction, Harvard.
John Mack.
John Mack. Yeah. Harvard psychiatrist, Nobel Prize winner, right? Was it Nobel Prize?
Pulitzer.
Pulitzer Prize. And, you know, he firmly believed some stuff that was, you know, crazy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and he's an interesting one. You know, just to frame that further, he is well known in UFO research as being this serious researcher that went out and kind of explored these areas. One of the things that he's famous for is his conversation with the Dalai Lama about the abduction research that he was doing, right? And it's framed in the UFO culture as, well, see how serious this is. John Mack, Harvard, goes over there, he's talking to the Dalai Lama, they're having this conversation, and this is how serious the subject is. Well, if there, you know, that works until you do the background research. And one of the things in the background research is talking to the people who were around the Dalai Lama when that was going on. And there's an anthropologist was taking a boat trip. I don't know whether it was in India or in Nepal, and it happened to be that one of the Dalai Lama's private guards was on the boat, and they got into a conversation, and the guard was talking about idiots who come over to talk to the Dalai Lama, and you know how patient the Dalai Lama is in having these Westerners who ask these stupid questions, and how the guard was never sure if he should be more on point in, you know, getting these people away, and you know how many different really stupid people were able to come and talk to the Dalai Lama. And he goes, there was this one time, there was this guy comes in, and he's a well-known researcher, and he starts asking about aliens, and it was the stupidest thing, and we all laughed at him afterwards. But he was one of those crazy people. So if that had never come out, if the anthropologists had never had that conversation, you know, John Mack's visit to the Dalai Lama is framed as this intercultural, you know, great, wonderful talk of alien reality. But the reality on the ground was that the Dalai Lama was being patient, and he was talking to anyone who came in, and the guards were actually concerned that crazy guy had gotten in and was talking about aliens and wasting the Dalai Lama's time, you know.
And for folks who don't understand media, and of course you study the media, I've studied the media, I've spent a lot of time in the media and writing for it, as well as being on various shows. People just don't want to understand. They want to not, particularly in this area, grasp the role of reframing.
Right.
Now, things are constantly put on a frame or a spin that gives it an appearance that simply does not reflect what really happened.
Right.
And that is to grab your attention. It's an entrainment method. It grabs your attention, gets you to read the article, gets you to do the clickbait, gets you to do whatever that keeps the advertisers running. And that's not to say there's no such thing as news out there, but increasingly there's very little. And even what you get as news increasingly is so narrowed down and simplified that it's almost worthless. It truly is. And when we start moving into these more obscure areas, such as what we're talking about here, whether it's UFOs or psychic research, it's almost impossible to get anything reasonable. And that's what strikes me, is how many occultists are just so thrilled about these recent UFO disclosures from the Pentagon.
Right.
I just see it as a giant not even disinformation, just a giant distraction campaign.
Well, I have, I don't know if I have it here. I played a joke on one of my friends. I sent him a photo of a magazine cover that said the Pentagon is finally taking UFOs seriously. And, I said, finally, they're taking it seriously. And he was like, yeah, that's great. This is awesome. All this news that's coming out. And I said, oh, wait a second. This magazine's from 1967. It was Look magazine from 1967. The one of the feature articles in it was, the Pentagon is finally taking UFOs seriously. And, one of the things I've been doing, I've been looking at the mediation of the UFO topic in ufology. And I've been going back to, 1958 and actually getting the primary sources, not just reading a second, third hand remembrance of an article that maybe was written and then you don't get any of the other context, but actually looking at the magazines from 1973, from, 1958, some of the Ray Palmer flying saucer magazines. And you could copy and paste it to today. I mean, I could literally probably get away with just completely plagiarizing some of these articles and putting them up as if they were, contemporary to what's going on now. And that again, it's really interesting to see these kind of microcosms of, mediation, because you can look at the UFO and track where it began and, these ideas that have developed around it. And it's been, I'm cynical on the media, having had, the same kind of thing. I've worked in the media. I've worked around the media. My brother worked as a producer on the 700 Club for Pat Robertson. I've been exposed to the whole gamut of media. And even with that, I've been surprised at going back to these old magazines and these old newspapers and actually looking at the context and seeing just how I don't even know what the word would be, but just how shallow the coverage is now, and then just how mediated this concept of this new, or this this idea of newness, or this idea of that we're coming to some other level of understanding in that. I mean, there's articles from the 70s on UFO databases, right? Like UFO takes a computerized look at UFO reports. They still don't have a good database of the sightings that's publicly available, and here's an article from 1977 about this new innovative, databasing of these things. So, and that's just a microcosm. If you think about, like, that's one subject. Well, what about esoteric practice, which isn't, how mediated is that now, with the popular media? As it becomes, I mean, there's these articles about what was it, witchcraft coming back into vogue, right? Like that was that last year, this year?
Yes.
And this rise of the witch and all this stuff. And Andrew Chestnut, who is chair of Catholic studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I work with him on some of the Santa Muerte research. He had posted that article, and I said, "Oh, which revival is this one? Is this the one now? But is this the same one as the one 5 years ago, or is this the 1958 witchcraft revival that was the revival? Oh, or is this the 1800s? Was this the late 1800s witchcraft revival? Like which one are we talking about with this new revival where witchcraft is coming out? And it's." When you get it in, and that's just these are all media things, and if that's what people are taking in terms of where they're kind of developing their inner work, that needs to be considered.
Yeah, there's sort of a phenomenon of Groundhog Day with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is that, and it's not just a matter of having, fortunate enough to be able to live long enough to see it, but it's who you know. And where do they get their information from? And there is a real lack of historical understanding on a cultural level. We have some folks who are wonderful historians. We know that. Esoteric history as an academic study has exploded over the last 20 to 30 years, particularly thanks to the works of Antoine Favre and others through the European schools. But the fact is, academic study is in itself a mediated research area, right? Because they always do what is safe. They do not go out on a limb. because they want tenure, they want to keep their jobs, they want funding. So we don't see not even a whole picture, but I even begin to wonder what even fragment of the picture we get.
Right.
I think it's increasingly smaller than I would have even given it credit for. But framework-wise, the quality of a lot of the material that we used to have in the pop culture was superior up until about the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And they took a dramatic downward turn in the late 80s into the 90s, early 2000s. And there is a bit of a return to some better quality stuff, but now you still have, again, the occult culture, the fashionable talismanic publishing.
Right.
Where highly expensive books are purchased.
Yeah.
And some of them are beautiful. I've got a few, okay? Some of them are very nice. But that's not an experience. That's a collection.
Right.
And they go for what is always trendy. A lot of this so-called left-hand path, a lot of so-called demonology, grimoire stuff, mostly that kind of what would pass as, oh, it's edgy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. With some comic book illustrations in there. And, that's, again, kind of with the idea of where do these things sort of, bridge into other areas. I'm always interested in like the, cheap newspaper print, Book of Cyprian, right? Like the Spanish version that you can pick up at the local Botanica. Like what's the value of that versus one that costs, $100 and is leather bound and is, nicely created in its artisanal wrappings. If you're actually doing the practice, does it matter? I mean, one may have a better translation in it, but maybe not necessarily. And that's been really interesting with the Santa Muerte culture is having the opportunity to do more study on that and to see that. One of the things like with William Walker Atkinson, for instance, you'd be hard pressed to find his books anywhere now, without ordering them on Amazon. You couldn't go into Barnes and Noble. Well, maybe the Kabbalion. You probably could still pick up the Kabbalion. But for the most part, he published a ton of books and they're not readily available. But if you go to a Botanica, you can pick up his books in Spanish language editions right now. They're still in publication.
I think that's important to note. There's some Atkinson in collections that I've seen in the Kabbalion, and behind me is almost all of the books you're talking about.
Right.
Those are all on the shelves behind me, and they are from that period. They belong to my great uncle. So this was something I grew up reading. I grew up around it, and it's a very different culture when it's lived than when it's just read, and that these cultures would often absorb things. And someone asked me, when you're talking about folk magic or Brauka or powwow, where would that go in terms of like new thought? And I said, well, technically it's not part of it, but where's the breakoff date? Because it was for my great uncle,
right?
And I know it would have been for dozens of other practitioners out there because they would have been reading it,
right? Well, and that's you find that with especially in Southern folk magic, where DeLawrence publications, where DeLawrence was, he was plagiarizing Waite, right, with his book on the tarot. He plagiarized in his great Hindu book of magic. He has he plagiarized quite a few people in that one, but he has he includes all that. But these books were within the conjure doctor's fold, right? Like they were the ones that they were picking up. And so you had this mix of new thought, hypnotism, and all the rest of it, and as well as, Golden Dawn and that influence as well, which were in, what's, folk magic, this, which is they're in folk practice, especially in the Caribbean, where DeLawrence, or actually West Africa as well, DeLawrence, would ship to the Caribbean and West Africa. In the Caribbean, certain types of folk magic are actually called DeLawrence or high science. And, you know, those include Golden Dawn, you know, they include Frater Akkad, because he did the book on crystal scrying.
Mhm.
So that, you know, that's included there. And you'll see, you know, now still, and back, you know, in the early 20th century, you'll see practitioners with crystal balls, and people think like, oh, that's the gypsy fortune teller. And that's not at all what it is. They're getting it from the 1800 scrying practice. You know, I mean, William Walker Atkinson has a book on scrying. Frater Akkad did a book on scrying, and Akkad's book on scrying is actually how to achieve divine union with scrying. It's not just practical magic, you know, and all that was available to them in these catalogs, and it was available to them, you know, in practice, because, you know, you see the accoutrements of the practice, and then you also, you know, you can see that the books were there, you know, and that.
You know, you said something really important there. It was available to them in the catalogs, and folks often don't understand what we went through at times to get material. You would order it and you'd wait 4 to 6 weeks.
Right.
You might have to take a bus into New York or maybe down to Philadelphia and hope that the stores were open when you got there.
Right.
It was not a matter of just going on Amazon and having it feed to you the paid advertising of what are the most popular titles and what you should
Right.
be reading, or using these, you know, computer directed reviews, the algorithms that direct purchases.
Right.
And within that framework, we also see that witchcraft, real traditional witchcraft, was really a book science. You know, we talk, you know, the mythology, the modern mythology is of, you know, the old religion and handed down orally. The reality is, when you look at what witches did, particularly in the 50s during the revival, this was a variation of grimoire magic.
Right.
And even when you see some of the older things that Peterson has published, it's a variation of Solomonic or grimoire magic to some degree.
Right.
So the role of AMORC then comes in. AMORC was the first organization in the early 20th century to successfully have a massive correspondence course. There were others. Brotherhood of Light out of Los Angeles had a correspondence course. There were numerous New Thought correspondence courses. But I am hard pressed. I mean, I know there were some groups that have come and gone, like the Order of Essenes, the Mayan Order. You know what I'm talking about, right? These groups. But in terms of longevity, survivability, practicality, and impact, I'm hard pressed to find a group that was more influential, love it or leave it, than AMORC.
Yeah, and that's, you know, you think we had talked a little bit about the UFO thing. Well, Jacques Vallée and J. Allen Hynek both led into some of their studies. Vallée was from France, and so he was kind of collecting Sidir and some of the older stuff in first editions and that. But he, you know, once he got over to the United States, AMORC was kind of his thing that he got hooked into, and it was where him and Hynek actually connected at the very beginning.
And some of the people mentioned in his memoir, I know personally.
Right, right.
And when he was talking about the whole notion of the one occult grand master who had this great episode, which he used as an example of how occultists are so quick to support totalitarianism and authoritarian regimes. I recognize that experience from, it was from Raymond Bernard, who was the French Grand Master, and he would have known him at that time.
Right.
But it's interesting to look at that because AMORC advertised, and they were criticized for their widespread advertising and their widespread open door membership to anyone who could wanted to belong or improve themselves. But that goes back to what you were saying about that's what gave it value. That's what gave it impact.
Right, absolutely. And it also gave, you know, one of the things we kind of had this conversation before, and I was trying to see where, like, how deep did that go? You know, because they were in all the popular magazines, they were in, you know, a lot of that. It was in the Farmer's Almanac. So if you think about the reach of the Farmer's Almanac, you know, that's not, that's not who you think is doing this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? That's not your high level urbanite, suburban practitioner. Farmer's Almanac was literally something that people bought to see when they planted. I mean, this is a very, like, truly agrarian publication, whatever it is, in terms now that it's a little more geared towards kind of a suburban gardening, but back in the, but it still is used. I mean, it still has the calendars and all that. And this, they advertised in there, so who's accessed this material, and then this idea, it really breaks down, as you were saying, it breaks down this concept of, these ignorant, like, rural peasants out there, like, unable to read and do whatever, in that, these practices and that were available in a wide level. And a lot of the things that people think of as folk actually tie into what they think of as high culture.
Well, I'm trying to remember the name of a book. It was written by a historian for the Mormons. And I spoke with the author many years ago when I was doing research on my book on Freemasonry, because he had mentioned that in the rural South, roughly around 1820, a traveling book salesman did $20,000 worth of business in a year selling occult titles.
Right.
I mean, this is a staggering amount of money. And it goes against the notion that we see both in popular culture about occultism always being on the fringes when it's often not, but also, again, the mediation now, this coastal urban hip culture view of occultism and magic, where they more or less look down upon anything rural or in the flyover states they so dismissively refer to us as. When I say, it's not that we just do magic better here, it's we've been doing it longer.
Right.
And maybe you could address that a little bit, because that really is something we've been talking around. It ties into the dismissiveness within contemporary culture, and particularly a snobbishness within contemporary culture with regards to what is the occult, what is practice, and all of these things.
Yeah, and it, this actually came up when I was talking to the psychokinesis experiencer. This weird othering and this weird kind of exoticism, and I kind of mentioned it earlier with the Santa Muerte thing, sort of in a different way, but this search for authenticity, where you see, especially with the kind of popularization of folk practice, and that in an aesthetic way, where these people would never ever go to where actual people are. I mean, they wouldn't, like, there's no way they would live in the rural South, like they wouldn't live in a rural area, but they seek this authenticity, and I see that with the Santa Muerte stuff, where it's become popular with kind of like a hipster set. And it's really hilarious to me, because I know that they would never go to the places in Mexico where, Santa Muerte is popular, and wouldn't be able to integrate. One, just because of a kind of I call it Christophobia, but they wouldn't go to a devout Catholic. They wouldn't understand a devout Catholic who had Saint Death on their altar. There's this concept of the kind of ignorant. I don't know. It's not even ignorant like rural, but just this class divide kind of thing, or this cultural divide. And we I often kind of look at this when I'm reading about, contemporary write-ups of, Georgia or what it's like in a rural area. Especially recently, there's a lot of focus on, the plight of rural areas and that. And, to some extent, I mean, yes, there's struggles, and there's definitely like the economic issue in that is huge. I mean, the poverty and everything is a struggle, but that's not, the way it's written up is not the everyday lived experience, and the same thing goes with this concept of kind of high practice and low practice. And it goes back to what you were talking about, in terms of the, that connection with the sensory experience, and that, and the quietude that you can experience here. um you know i I often think about this. What are people looking for? You think of like the Grail quest, right? What do they want? Like, to take it to pop culture, do they want the shiny glow, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Are they going to take the gold cup, or are they going to take the stone cup? You know? And I think that a lot of people have this really weird idea about what they're going to get at the end of their path. And that bleeds into kind of this interpretation of um, what other people in other areas are doing, or what they think, or how they act. I've got um, friends in Haiti who do some artwork tied around Craig Williams writings, you know, um, and they're reading Craig's books, but you wouldn't necessarily think that from seeing that. They live in a important in an area that's really struggling, but they have incredibly complex um kind of symbol sets that they're working with in their work, and including kind of integrating Craig's work with that, and you seeing the interactions that some people have with them. I think that was, that was a good example for me, was when um, people wanted, people will, in the occult culture kind of thing, they'll look for voodoo art, right? Because you have the some of the I don't know, the Gnostic Voodoo kind of work, right? And so you have a whole bunch of European, uh, you know, I hesitate to say this, but trust fund, people that are kind of, they've got their professional gigs and their tattoos and whatever, but they have a highly aestheticized voodoo art that they'll buy. Well, the people in Haiti are actually doing the art as well, and they really do practice voodoo, voodoo, to be more correct with that. But they actually do the work and culture, and won't buy together. The a lot of people in the culture will buy the mediated nonsense, kind of came out of a comic book stuff, or came out of whatever they think, this kind of like highly aestheticized occultism is, but they wouldn't even recognize the stuff that folks in Haiti are doing. And I've seen it directly just in terms of the interactions with the artists.
Well, this goes
And it's,
back to, I'm sorry, you broke up there in the transmission. Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay. Well, this ties into several points. One is not only the notion of culture and media then deciding what constitutes magic, but also, and Craig and I spoke about this at length, and I have with others over the years. You can't have a traditional experience if you don't have a traditional experience.
Right.
So if your notion of what is coming strictly from reading, when you have a teaching given to you, three things have to take place. One is you have to know the origin of it. Two, you have to know how to do it. And three, you have to know what to expect from it. And that usually means it's a living teaching. And you see that, and I'll just pull out the Golden Dawn now because it's everyone's favorite punching bag, but just because it's widely known. How many people haven't done banishing rituals but didn't really know what they're getting rid of?
Right.
Doing banishing over and over again, but they don't know what it's really for, what they're supposed to be getting rid of. So if you don't know what to expect from a teaching, then you'll never know if it actually worked. And the only way you're going to know what can happen is if it's part of something vital and living, or if you pay really careful attention, really, really
Right.
very close attention. And most people don't have that in the beginning because they don't know what to pay attention to. But that also ties in then to the vitalism of the experience and where the energies are of the person who is practicing, but also how their energies are being assaulted. And again, going back to the rural versus urban divide, I find it fascinating now. And I think as we move through this coronavirus crisis, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of people's experience with the occult culture. Because, we've talked quite a bit about different types of conspiracies and conspiracy theories. And we don't even like that word. I mean, I don't, because conspiracies happen. People agree to do things. They either do it legally or they do it illegally, but people come to agreements. And not all conspiracies take place around a table. There's a conspiracy of attitude. If you imbue a group of people with the same values, and they'll come to the same conclusions, the same decisions. And that was what written about in 1980 by the wonderful folks at Stanford Research Institute in the book you pointed out to me, who were the same ones doing UFO research, psychic research, and early internet stuff.
Yeah.
So we don't have to have people sitting, they said, you don't have to have people sitting around a table. You just have to reinforce the same value structure.
Right.
And that being said, there was a lot of, performance art as magic. Is it or isn't it? And who was that Serbian artist that came under some fire?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I said, well, that's magic. That's folk magic. Look she's using blood. She knows what she's doing. And a lot of Golden Dawn folks, came down. I said, look, you wouldn't know magic, real magic, if it's right in front of you, because if it doesn't look like a Golden Dawn ritual, you don't understand it.
Right.
But that's part of the restriction of framing that often takes place.
Right. I see that with the Santa Muerte research with altar space, where I have a friend who he's from East Texas, and he had a really intense kind of initiation into Santa Muerte that was very personal to him, and that but he started building these altars that were just from his family, right? That went back. So it was an 1800s Bible from his family, and, photos of family members that had passed away, the shovels that he'd actually buried his parents with. He does geo-surveying, so he would pick up different skulls and that kind of thing, and bones. And he was just doing this almost kind of like found art meditation kind of thing with these different objects. And then, there would be Santa Muerte in it, and he would, have money, and it was, he was just doing what came naturally to him, growing up kind of in a charismatic environment and having some, a little bit of experience with Wicca and that. But there was nothing, he wasn't buying things to put on his altar. It was all these things that he had passed down to him. And, in some ways it was like a place where he could keep his family stuff and not just shove it in a closet, So he took some photos, and it wasn't like, I'm showing off my altar. It was just like, this is where I live. And he was in a trailer. And so he took photos of it. And because he was interacting with the Santa Muerte community in Mexico, people started actually contacting him and asking him for work, like spiritual work. Like, hey, could you put a blessing on your altar for me to do this? I need a job. Could you do some work so that I can get a job? And he'd send this to me and be like, what's going on? Like, why are these people sending me these things? And I was like, because you created a real altar. And he was like, well, what's the difference between this and all these people who are taking photos of their altar and it's nicely lit, it's clean, and they've got everything? And I'm like, because you have a working altar. You have items from your family. You have items that have a resonance to them because they've true meaning. You didn't just go to the store and be like, oh, I need a pentagram and I need a knife and I need the rest of it. These are all things that came from your family and they accumulated and they work, and that the fact that without him saying anything other than putting up prayers and photos of this altar, he started getting requests for spiritual work. That to me was such a huge lesson in what the difference was. And you can see that too in terms of, again, with the popular voodoo and voodoo practitioners versus folks that are living in an area where it's actually being practiced. The place where it's being practiced, a lot of times the altars look like a mess. There's candle wax everywhere. It's because they're working altars, like they're doing work, and they're not worried about taking a picture for Instagram. It's not this aesthetic structure. It's an actual working thing. And that is, there's such a glaring difference. And it was just amazing to me that that difference was so clearly demonstrated when this guy from East Texas just did what he was doing during his contemplative practice with Santa Muerte and with his just kind of devotional practice with it. And suddenly people from the culture are like, hey, this looks real. This is real. You've got some power. Help me with my stuff. His mother-in-law, he got married to a Mexican lady, and his mother-in-law has actually asked him to do work for her, spiritual work, cleansings and stuff. And he's like, I don't know what I'm doing, so and so it's real enough where even when he gets into the environment itself, he's being requested to do the spiritual work.
Well, that's just, it's so typical of what we see, is that these working altars they're not like a church altar in the sense that it's cleaned regularly and it's for public consumption. It may be cleaned regularly, but it's still not for public consumption.
Right.
And that real practitioners aren't posting pictures. They know the axiom of the Sphinx to remain silent.
Right.
Occasionally, there are some exceptions, but you know what I'm referring to.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That as a general rule, you don't say anything about your work, and because you shouldn't need to.
Right.
Who's the work for?
Yeah.
If you want to do work for hire and you're good, word will get around.
Right.
And if it doesn't, then you should be doing something else.
Right.
But that's interesting how many folks I know want to do magical work for hire. It's a stunning phenomena how that part of the subculture creates itself. And they do. It's like my wife, one of her friends, her ex-wife or whatever, or late girlfriend, after the divorce, goes off and takes a I don't know, something like a 3-month course on meditation, and instantly she's a mindfulness instructor.
Right. Right.
And jokingly, I was who was I talking to? I was talking to a client a few weeks ago, and I jokingly said, well, a few months ago, I got an email from a friend of mine, said, hey, this place is looking for work or to hire. I said, what is it? And it had something to do with holistic health. And I looked at the description of the job, and I said, well, let's see what this is, because it's part-time. It wasn't full-time. It was some kind of contract work. And I said, I'm going to send in a resume and see what happens. And it's just, it's like, wow, the notion of how these notions of the psychospiritual, the holistic, are so mediated that they don't have a connection or even a sense of the connection to their true roots in occultism.
Right.
And folk magic. And what we see is a compartmentalization of things. And that's kind of the whole package, isn't it? The urban practitioner compartmentalizes. Oh, this is my magic. I do this here. Or when I'm not doing this here, I'm taking pictures of myself in front of the club. This is, not that kind of magic, or only this is magic. But there seems to be an excessive compartmentalization. And yet, that's exactly what we're seeing reflected in our current social environment with
Right.
stay at home. I mean, it's like we've been mugged by Saturn. Saturn's come in and laid everything low. And we really are now these strange kind of separate pieces. Everything seems to be increasingly divided, compartmentalized, cut up. So kind of this leads me into the next question. What do you see as the most important things? What do you see as the crisis of the age and the most important thing that practitioners need to look out for, but also look towards and look for?
In terms of practice, I think mediation is the illusion, this just complete illusory nature of it. I think that, it's important to get down to the roots of practice, to get down to the roots of awareness and of what you're doing. I think it's important to uh be, I want to use the word playful, but in a dangerous sense, in the sense that I think that the fundamentalism, we're seeing that across the board. Fundamentalism is, depending on where it hits, it's either annoying or it's absolutely dangerous to society and to people's freedom, and I think that the good thing of fundamentalism, or what fundamentalism pretends to do, um, which is to hold some kind of traditional value, or to hold these lines of transmission safe from the past. I think that the reality of that, holding those lines, is important. But the false front that fundamentalism provides, that claims it does that, is really dangerous. And to seek, instead of seeking authenticity in the outer stuff, I think people should seek authentic, on a kind of inner level and a secret level, you know, um, uh, to seek true authenticity, to seek that out, and to go and to actually, to find it in the everyday, and to break down, like you were talking about the compartmentalism thing, to recognize that there's been no point in time where true practice is a thing that you do over here versus where you go and do your regular day job and all the rest of it. Um, Blending the two, they're always blended, but it's not that you need to have, that doesn't mean that your day job is being a wizard, right? Like that doesn't mean that at all. It means that the lessons that you carry and your contacts and your whole kind of being is changed into your job. I work for a university, and everything, there's no differentiation in what I do. What I learn in one area carries over to another. I mean, it's, mindfulness, they've tried to bring out and sell as a way to get people to calm down in the workplace when you're stuck in a cubicle and going crazy. Well, if you actually do practice mindfulness, you can work in that cubicle and not go crazy, and then you can also utilize that as a jumping off point to be able to know that you can, move outside of that and have freedom in that. Not that you can be, a kind of mind slave in a cubicle that's calm, but actually have the power and be empowered by those practices to, operate in that environment, um, in a much fuller way. And I think that really, because of the internet and because of the hyperconnectivity, well, a false sense of hyperconnectivity, and because of just the heavy mediation, that is now more important than ever to really just focus on the basics of practice in that and get a strong grip in that. You bring it up in terms of you know, the idea of, you know, psychoanalysis before getting into the work, you know your psyche, know where you're at, know those aspects of it, and then you're capable of moving forward into actually doing the practice. You know, Israel Regardie was real big on that idea, the idea of analyzing yourself before you try to jump in the car, you know, get the driver's license, you know. And I think the basics get missed when, you know, because and that goes back to this kind of artisanal grimoire culture, right? Like, you don't need an artisanal grimoire if you can't do any of the, you know, the practices that would lead up to that. You know what I mean? You're spending $100 and you don't have any access to it. You know, it's kind of crazy.
Well,
And you know,
many people don't know, but Leszewski's first book, the one which he used for his successful evocations, and just to remind listeners who may not have read the memoir I did, I met his friend, the one who was in the evocations with him. I met him before I met Joe.
right.
And I thought that was very interesting. This guy calls me, you know, looking for some help. He listening to his credentials, you know, former military, retired, chaplain, all this stuff from the area. Okay, this stands out in your memory. And then when Joe starts talking about his friend, I said, I met your friend. I met this guy. He goes, well, when? Yeah. And his first book was DeLawrence's Book of Hindu Magic.
Right.
That's the one he used, which goes back to the notion of why mind training is so important, because what makes it all work is your belief, the dog's tooth. You have to have the confidence that it will work. And you only get that through progressive experiences and progressive understanding of yourself.
Right. So that, I think that, I mean, that's it. That's the thing. That right there encapsulates the whole, that's kind of, you know, where I float in, you know, DeLawrence, right? Like, just, you know, grab it from the grocery store. If you can't do it with the thing in the grocery store, like, you don't have it, you know. I think that's my big takeaway. If you can't go to the gas station and find magic, you probably don't know where to look, you know.
Well, that is what I want to close this on. That was just a perfect quote, and I'm going to be using it in print. So those those who have listened to this and paid attention have a lot of areas to go to. And I just want to say thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And I want to thank you very much for all of your support over the years to my own work, to introducing me to Shannon Taggart, to George Hansen. I recently became Facebook friends with Diana Walsh Pasulka. I'm hoping that she likes the articles I sent her, and helping me so much to re-engage with psychic research and a lot of these areas. It's been wonderful. Well, I just want to share this. I mean, you and other people, it's the company we keep that help us move forward, and you're part of that company, and I value it.
Thank you, Mark. I feel the same way. Thank you for your support as well.
But with that, I want to say thank you for everyone for being here. And I look forward to hearing from your comments about this and other interviews that we're doing for archival purposes. So thank you.